Jim Hartley, the most respected veteran specialist at Lydian Medical Center, sat for his final interview before retirement. When the host asked if any patient had left a lasting impression on him, he fell silent for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. There is one. My worthless daughter. She graduated from one of the country's top medical schools, and then threw it all away to be with some penniless nobody. I only wanted what was best for her future. The night they'd secretly arranged to meet, I locked her in the house and kept them apart. What I never imagined was that the boy would go on to study medicine himself. These days, he's the youngest oncologist at Fairview General Hospital. A murmur rippled through the studio audience. Sensing an opening, the host pressed further. If it were happening now, would you still keep the two of them apart? Jim faltered. His eyes slowly reddened. It's too late for that. My daughter died of stomach cancer 3 years ago. The segment went viral the moment it aired, climbing straight to the top of the trending charts. Robbie McAvoy, the story's leading man, had no idea any of it had happened. He'd just wrapped up a critical stomach cancer surgery and was on his way home to meet his wife, Whitney Portman. Robbie McAvoy walked in the door just in time to catch the tail end of the interview playing on the screen. Beside him, his wife, Whitney Portman, let out a startled gasp. Honey, isn't that your ex-girlfriend's father? I heard his daughter. Before she could finish, Robbie's voice cut through the room, cold as ice. I've never had an ex-girlfriend. Whitney froze. As if realizing how harsh he'd sounded, Robbie pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened. Whitney, I'm sorry. He crossed the room and bent down to kiss her forehead. Marrying you was the luckiest thing that's ever happened to me. Just promise me you won't bring up people who don't matter anymore, okay? When he said people who don't matter, something like hatred flickered through his eyes. My soul drifted silently at his side, and I didn't miss it. Even a heart that had stopped beating years ago could still ache. I let out a quiet sigh. 6 years, and he still hated me this much. Hated me for standing him up. Hated me for vanishing when he needed me most. Hated me for letting him hear about my engagement to someone else. And most of all, hated me for failing to save his grandma Maggie. That hatred had become the fuel that drove him to claw his way to the top. In just 5 years, he'd become the youngest rising star in the hospital. More celebrated than even my father had ever been. The same man who'd once looked down on him. Whitney didn't say anything else. She just patted his back gently, a small comfort. A little while later, Robbie got called in for an emergency surgery. He didn't even stop to eat, just grabbed his keys and rushed back to the hospital. The moment he stepped through the doors, he ran into my father, who'd just come from finishing his interview. Robbie's expression darkened instantly. He walked past as if he hadn't seen him at all. Only as they passed each other did he catch the old man's quiet sigh. What happened back then? I'm the one who wronged you both. Robbie didn't break stride. No need to apologize. He tilted his head, his tone dripping with sarcasm. In fact, I should be thanking you for tearing me and Selena apart back then. If you hadn't, I never would have gotten where I am today, and I never would have met a wife as sweet and devoted as Whitney. Did you know? It wasn't until after I left Selena that I realized there was a woman this perfect in the world. With that, Robbie didn't spare Jim another glance. He turned and walked away without looking back. The grueling 4-hour surgery wrapped up soon after. While Robbie was scrubbing out, the anesthesiologist came over and let out a long breath. That was way too close. The patient's eyes flew open halfway through, scared me half to death. He paused. Come to think of it, a surgery that risky. Back in the day, only you and Selena Hartley could have pulled it off, right? He shook his head. Such a shame she'd already quit by the time you joined the hospital. Otherwise, I could have watched the two of you work together, as husband and wife. Before he could finish, the faucet shut off with a sharp click, and silence dropped over the room. After a long moment, Robbie gave a thin smile. You've got it wrong. She and I were never married. My soul drifted in the air, and I gave a bitter smile. He wasn't wrong. Robbie and I never made it to the altar, not even at the very end. 6 years ago, Robbie didn't hate me the way he does now. Quite the opposite. He loved me more than anyone else in the world. He used to bring me home-cooked dinners whenever I worked late, pick me up from work every single day without fail, and once threw himself between me and a knife-wielding relative of a patient without a second thought. The day his grandma Maggie was diagnosed with stomach cancer, Robbie, a man who always had everything under control, looked lost for the first time. He sat outside the hospital alone until dark, and when I finally came out, he instinctively tried to hide the report behind his back. I snatched it away. The moment I saw the diagnosis, my chest tightened. But he was still smiling. It's fine. The doctor said it's not serious. I didn't call him out on the lie. That night, I pulled every resource I could find and reached out to my mentors and colleagues. I stayed up for 2 straight nights putting together the safest possible surgical plan for her. When I dragged myself exhausted to see him, this man, who hadn't shed a single tear even after learning Grandma Maggie had cancer, finally let his eyes go red. Fat tears rolled down his face as he cupped my cheek. Selena, are you tired? I kissed the corner of his mouth and smiled. The day Grandma Maggie's surgery succeeds, let's go get our marriage license. Robbie froze. Then, after a long moment, he broke down and cried. He told me he must have saved the galaxy in a past life to deserve me. He said the greatest happiness of his life would be making me his wife. We walked home hand in hand, looking forward to Grandma Maggie's recovery and to registering our marriage together. Then my father came back from a business trip abroad and found out I was planning to marry Robbie. He refused outright. What's so special about some penniless nobody? I didn't raise you all these years just to watch you throw yourself away like this. We argued, and in a fit of rage he struck me across the face. Before I could even recover, he shoved me into my room and locked the door, determined to stop me from going through with the marriage. I pounded on the door, begging him to understand. Grandma Maggie's surgery mattered, it really mattered. I screamed myself hoarse, pleading with him to at least let me finish the operation. But my father didn't believe me. He was convinced it was nothing more than an excuse to go see Robbie. He even went so far as to drive to the hospital, where Robbie was anxiously waiting for me to come perform Grandma Maggie's surgery. By the time my father was done talking, I'd become, in his telling, a woman who was already engaged to someone else. A woman who'd never cared about Robbie or his grandmother at all. She's happy now. I'd advise you not to go bothering her. Grandma Maggie heard every word of it. Grandma Maggie's condition took a sudden, violent turn, spiraling downward without warning. Every doctor on staff tried everything they could to save her, but the surgery she needed, only I could perform it. By the time I broke through the door and ran out, my feet were bleeding. By the time I reached the hospital, it was already too late. I became the doctor responsible for a catastrophic medical error. Grandma Maggie's resuscitation failed, and she died in agony. Robbie stood at the end of the hallway, his eyes cold as ice. I liked you. More fool me. But what did my grandmother ever do to deserve this? The youngest oncologist at Lydian Medical Center, Selena Hartley. Is this how you treat your patients? My grandmother is dead. Are you satisfied now? I shook my head frantically, desperate to explain. But Robbie wouldn't so much as look at me again. He turned and walked away, indifferent. Because of what happened, my father and I had a violent falling out. I signed papers formally cutting all ties with him and left without looking back. Furious, my father used his influence to have me blacklisted from the entire medical profession. By my third year working at the factory, I couldn't stop the stomach pain, couldn't stop coughing up blood. Years of medical experience told me immediately, my body wasn't going to hold out much longer. The memory had run long. By the time I surfaced from it, Robbie had already turned the faucet back on. The anesthesiologist stood there for a long moment, looking embarrassed, and scratched his head. Sorry, you two seemed so close back then, I just assumed. A flicker of mockery crossed Robbie's eyes. Close was a word that only applied to the past. Whatever we'd once had was long gone by the time it ended. The year cancer was tearing me apart. Robbie had just pulled off an incredibly successful surgery that made him a rising star in the medical world. He was the only one who could treat what I had. But I didn't dare go find him. 3 years earlier, Grandma Maggie's death had haunted me like a nightmare that wouldn't let go. Countless nights, twisted with physical pain. I woke up crying from that same dream, apologizing over and over, drowning in regret, hating my father, hating myself. But fate loves its little twists of drama. After I collapsed in my rented room, my landlady found me and immediately called an ambulance. I was rushed to the hospital, and when the doctor learned I was refusing treatment, he asked me, stunned, why. I gave a bitter laugh and told him it was because I didn't have the money. The doctor went quiet. As I was leaning against the wall, making my way out, I ran straight into Robbie. He was dressed in a crisp white coat, discussing a cancer surgery plan with another doctor nearby. The moment he saw me, the smile vanished from his lips. What are you doing here? I hesitated. 1,000 things I wanted to say collapsed into one sentence. Robbie, the thing that happened 3 years ago. Can you forgive me? He glanced at me once, his gaze cool and distant, and tossed out a single line without turning back. Only if you're dead. I stood frozen, staring at his retreating back, and gave a bitter smile, thinking I would be dead soon enough. And then maybe he'd finally forgive me. I blinked my dry eyes and came back to myself, looking down at Robbie. He'd already finished drying his hands and was walking out, his face blank. In the hallway, he ran into my father again, who'd come to finish up his retirement paperwork. Only then did Robbie's mouth twist into something like a smirk as he finally answered the anesthesiologist's earlier question. There's nothing between me and someone like Selena Hartley. Never was. My father's steps faltered. He looked at Robbie, his expression complicated. After a long moment, he let out a heavy sigh. Don't blame Selena for what happened back then. She didn't do anything wrong. It was all on me. But she'll never hear any of it now, Jim said. Robbie's movements stilled for a moment. He swept a cold glance over my father's face. Jim seemed lost in some private grief, his voice heavy. Tomorrow I'm taking Selena's ashes and leaving the country. If there's anything you still want to say to her, you can find her at the cemetery on the west side of town. Robbie stood rooted to the spot, the overhead light washing his face pale. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there when the anesthesiologist's hesitant voice pulled him back. What did Dr. Hartley mean by that? Now that I think about it, I really haven't heard anything about Selena in a long time. Robbie shed his scrubs, his expression settling back into its usual indifference. He hung the garment on the rack, his tone mocking. A woman like her always had a flair for the dramatic. Though I do need to take tomorrow off, to go to the cemetery on the west side of town. To confirm something? Robbie lowered his gaze, his tone even. Don't read into it. Tomorrow's my grandmother's death anniversary. I'm just going to see her. He added, I just hope I don't run into anyone irrelevant while I'm there. But he was disappointed. The next day, just as Robbie finished his visit to his grandmother's grave and turned to leave, he ran into my father anyway. At the sight of him, my father's hand froze mid-motion as he was tending the grave. You came. Robbie lowered his eyes to the small, modest headstone, his voice giving nothing away. I didn't expect you'd actually go so far as to dig up a plot of land, just to convince me Selena is dead. He looked up. So tell me, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? My father was silent for a moment, then forced the words out. Robbie, the one who did wrong all those years ago was me, not Selena. If you want to hate someone, hate me. Back then, if I hadn't locked her in the house, if I hadn't stopped her from going to see you, she never would have missed the window to save your grandmother's life. It's all my fault. I'm the one who killed your grandmother. I'm the one who killed Selena. Watching my father's stooped back, I finally understood. These 3 years, he'd been tormented by this too. Eaten alive by it, day after day. But Robbie just let out a cold, sharp laugh. Shut up. You don't even deserve to speak about my grandmother. If Selena hadn't proposed what she did, my grandmother wouldn't have been left without a single piece of resuscitation equipment in the room when she stopped breathing. She's the one who killed my grandmother. My father's mouth opened, then closed. He staggered back, clutching at his chest. It took him a long moment to steady himself. He closed his eyes and in a hoarse voice said, the equipment had to be moved out of the room to make space for the surgery Selena had planned for your grandmother. That was the only way to guarantee it would go smoothly. That day, she tried desperately to explain it to me, and I refused to listen. I was so sure it was nothing but an excuse to go see you. Robbie crossed his arms, his tone flippant. Enough. Stop making up such pathetic lies. Is this whole performance just to get me here? Well, I'm here now. Where's Selena? Bring out the murderer. My father's whole body trembled. His lips shook as he reached with great effort into his coat and pulled something out. If you refuse to believe a word I say, then look at this. See for yourself what she actually did, and whether it matches what you've imagined all this time. The item Jim pulled from his coat was a thick, black leather-bound binder, its edges frayed and stained with dark, dried spots. Tucked beneath its strap was a thin, official hospital folder bearing the seal of Fairview General, Robbie's own hospital. Robbie didn't reach for it immediately. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his pale skin. What is this? Another dramatic setup. It's her journal, Jim said, his voice flat, drained of all the authority he had once wielded as Lydian's top specialist. The one she kept while I had her locked in her room. And behind it is her medical file from your hospital. From 3 years ago. Robbie's eyes flicked to the Fairview emblem on the folder. A strange, instinctual coldness bloomed in his chest. Slowly, almost against his will, he extended a gloved hand and took the bundle. My soul hovered beside him, watching his fingers brush against the worn leather. I remembered that binder. I had filled its pages by the dim light of my bedroom, using the edge of a plastic ruler to draw anatomical diagrams while my father screamed at me through the heavy oak door. Robbie opened the binder first. The dates were stamped in red ink at the top of every page. July 14th. Day 1 of confinement. Grandma Maggie's tumor is abutting the celiac axis. Standard resection carries an 80% mortality rate. Must modify the mesenteric approach. Father took my phone. Used the landline until he cut the cord. July 15th. Day 2. Formulated the modified 2-stage vascular clamp method. It's risky, but it's the only way to spare the hepatic artery. Pounded on the door until my knuckles bled. Father says I am ruining my life for a nobody. He doesn't understand. Robbie is waiting for me. Maggie is waiting for me. July 16th. 4 a.m. The portable suction and arterial line equipment I ordered them moved to room 402 yesterday. If the crisis hits before surgery, the standard ward gear won't be enough. I hope the floor nurses followed the directive. Father locked the window from the outside. Robbie's thumb froze on the page. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet cemetery. Room 402, Robbie whispered, his eyes scanning the lines again and again. The resuscitation gear. It was moved out of the main station to 402. She tried to create an emergency bypass setup right inside the room, Jim said, staring at the headstone. Because she knew your grandmother's vascular anatomy was too fragile for a standard transfer to the ICU if she collapsed. But when I went to the hospital that day, I saw the equipment being moved. I thought she was wasting hospital resources for her boyfriend's family. I ordered it all sent back to storage. Jim let out a hollow, broken laugh. I told the floor staff it was an unauthorized requisition. So when your grandmother crashed, the room was empty. Not because Selena neglected her, but because I dismantled her safety net. Robbie's hands began to shake. The black binder slipped an inch in his grip. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He flipped to the thin folder behind the binder. Fairview General Hospital, emergency triage record. Date, October 12, 3 years ago. Patient, Selena Hartley. Attending physician, Dr. Kachin. Diagnosis, advanced gastric adenocarcinoma with peritoneal carcinomatosis, stage 4. Clinical notes. Patient presented with severe epigastric pain, hematemesis, and marked cachexia. Recommended immediate palliative resection and 4 chemotherapy. Patient decision, refused treatment. Tucked inside the flap was a small, pink billing slip marked with a red stamp. Unpaid. Patient discharged at own request. Beneath it was a single line scribbled in the margins by the intake nurse. Patient stated she had no funds and no reason to prolong survival. Left building. At 14:30. Robbie's eyes stared at the date and time. October 12. 14:30. 3 years ago, on that exact date, at 14:20, Robbie had stood in the lobby of Fairview General, dressed in a crisp white coat, surrounded by colleagues, congratulating him on his first successful solitary resection. I remembered that afternoon vividly. I had been leaning against the cold marble pillar, clutching my stomach, barely able to stand. I had asked him, "Can you forgive me?" And he had looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust and replied, "Only if you're dead." 10 minutes later, I had signed the refusal of treatment form and walked out into the rain. The folder fell from Robbie's fingers, scattering white papers across the damp grass of the cemetery. Robbie didn't drive home. He drove straight to Fairview General, running 3 red lights along the way. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't greet the nurses at the station. He stormed down the surgical wing until he reached the office of Dr. Kenneth Chun, the senior oncologist who had been at Fairview for over 2 decades. Robbie kicked the door open. Dr. Chun looked up from his computer, startled. "Robbie, what's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a..." October 12. 3 years ago, Robbie rasped, his voice tearing at his throat. He slammed the pink billing slip onto Chen's desk. "Selena Hartley, you signed this triage form." Dr. Chen frowned, pulling the paper toward him. He adjusted his reading glasses, staring at the name for a long moment. Slowly, the color drained from the older doctor's face. "Selena," Chen murmured. "I remember her." Robbie leaned over the desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the polished wood. "Why didn't you tell me? She was in this hospital. She was under your care." "Under my care?" Chen looked at Robbie with a mixture of pity and sudden anger. "Robbie, she was brought in by a landlady from the industrial district. Weighed 80 pounds. Her stomach was full of ulcers and blood. I ran her scans, saw the Hartley name, and asked her if she was related to Jim Hartley. From Lydian." Chen leaned back, shaking his head bitterly. "Do you know what she told me? Begged me not to tell anyone. She said her father had disowned her, and that the only doctor at Fairview who knew her hated her more than life itself." Robbie's chest heaved. "She refused treatment because she couldn't afford it. She couldn't afford a single bottle of saline," Chen said softly. "I offered to write it off under the hospital's charity fund. I told her we had a brilliant young surgeon who specialized in gastric tumors. You, Robbie. I told her you could perform the resection." My soul drifted beside Robbie, watching his face crumble bit by bit. I remembered Dr. Chun saying those words to me in the small examination room. I remembered the fierce, desperate wave of panic that had seized me at the thought of Robbie seeing me like that, emaciated, pathetic, dying of the very disease he spent his life fighting. And what did she say? Robbie's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Chun looked Robbie dead in the eye. "She said she'd rather die than let you look at her with hatred while she was on the operating table. She said you had told her that the only way you'd forgive her was if she was dead. So she walked out." Chin pulled a small, dusty plastic drawer open from his desk and retrieved a clear Ziploc bag. "She left this on the intake desk. She dropped it when she collapsed near the doors and the nurse put it in lost and found. I kept it, hoping she'd come back for it. She never did." Chin placed the bag on the desk. Inside was a silver medical medal, the first place award from the National Surgical Competition 6 years ago. Engraved on the back were 2 names, Side by side, Robbie McAvoy and Selena Hartley. Robbie stared at the metal. A sound tore from his throat, a strangled, suffocating gasp, and he fell back against the wall, sliding down until his knees hit the linoleum floor. It was late evening when Robbie returned to his luxury apartment. Whitney was sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the news coverage of Jim Hartley's interview, which was still dominating the local headlines. When the front door opened, she stood up with a warm smile. "Honey, you're back. I made." She stopped. Robbie stood in the entryway, soaked in rain, his eyes bloodshot, holding the black leather binder and the Ziploc bag containing the metal. He looked hollowed out, like a man whose soul had been surgically removed. "Robbie." Whitney's smile faltered. She walked over, reaching out to touch his arm. "What happened? You look terrible." Robbie didn't pull away, but he didn't look at her either. His gaze was fixed on the silver medal in his hand. 3 years ago, Robbie said, his voice flat and raspy. "October 12. Do you remember that day?" Whitney froze. The subtle shift in her posture didn't escape my eyes, nor did it escape Robbie's. Her fingers twitched around her wine glass. "October 12? Whitney forced a light laugh. "Honey, that was 3 years ago. How am I supposed to remember a specific day?" "It was the day I performed my first successful solo gastric resection," Robbie said softly. "The day I got promoted to attending surgeon. We went out to dinner to celebrate. Do you remember what you gave me as a congratulatory gift?" Whitney's mouth went dry. I gave you a watch." "No," Robbie said, slowly turning his head to look at her. His eyes were terrifyingly dark. "You gave me a leather fountain pen. And you told me that a man who was starting a new life shouldn't carry any baggage from the past." He pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with mechanical precision. He opened an old, archived email folder, one he hadn't touched in years. "Today, I asked the IT department to restore my deleted external inquiries from 3 years ago," Robbie whispered. "And I found a message sent from an IP address belonging to a small clinic in the industrial district. It was an urgent request for a charity surgical consultation for a patient named Selena Hartley." Whitney's face went dead white. The email was read at 11 a.m. on October 12. Robbie continued, his voice rising, sharp as a scalpel. "It was marked as read, flagged as spam, and permanently deleted from my terminal. I was in surgery at 11 a.m. But you were in my office, Whitney. You had my password. You brought me lunch every Tuesday." Whitney stepped back, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Robbie, listen to me. Did you delete it?" Robbie roared, his composure shattering completely. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes wild with a mixture of fury and despair. "Did you delete it?" "Yes." Whitney screamed back, tears spilling from her eyes as she tried to pull free. "Yes, I deleted it. Because she was a ghost. She ruined your life 6 years ago. She broke your heart, her family destroyed your grandmother, and you were finally moving on. You were finally mine." She beat her fists against his chest. "If you had known she was dying, you would have thrown everything away to save her. You would have run to her. What about me, Robbie? I was your fiancé. I was the one who stood by you while you clawed your way up from nothing." Robbie let go of her abruptly, as if her touch burned him. He stumbled back, staring at her with utter horror. "She wasn't trying to ruin my life," Robbie whispered, his voice trembling so hard he could barely articulate the words. "She was trying to die quietly so I wouldn't have to carry the burden of her disease." He looked around the pristine, beautifully decorated apartment, the home he had built with Whitney, the life he had congratulated himself on achieving. Everything felt filthy. Everything felt built on top of a grave. "Get out," Robbie said quietly. Whitney gasped. "Robbie, get out," he shrieked, slamming his fist against the wall so hard the drywall cracked. "Get out of my house." The industrial district of the city was a grid of rusted iron, crumbling brick, and narrow alleys that smelled of damp concrete and cheap diesel. Robbie walked down the narrow corridor of a third-floor boarding house, his polished dress shoes stepping over cracked linoleum. I floated beside him, watching his silhouette in the dim amber light of the hallway bulbs. I recognized this place. This was where I had spent the last 2 years of my life, hiding from the world, counting the days until my body gave out. He stopped at room 304. An elderly woman opened the door, a worn wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She squinted up at Robbie's sharp suit and bloodshot eyes. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for." Robbie swallowed hard, the name catching in his throat. "Selena Hartley. She used to live here." The landlady's expression softened into something sad and ancient. "Ah, the doctor girl." Robbie's breath hitched. "You knew she was a doctor?" "She never said it outright," the landlady sighed, stepping aside to let him into the small, dusty room. "But a woman who spends her nights practicing Surgical knots on old rubber tubing with hands that shake from pain. You don't need to be a genius to figure it out. The room was nearly empty. A narrow iron bed, a small wooden desk, and a single window overlooking the factory chimneys. After she passed away 3 years ago, her father came and took most of her things, the landlady said, leaning against the doorframe. Left me a bit of money to keep the room empty for a while. Said he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else sleeping in the bed where his daughter suffered. Robbie walked over to the wooden desk. His fingers gently traced the deep scratches on the surface. Did she speak of me? He asked softly. The landlady let out a long sigh. She didn't speak much at all. Coughing up blood every morning takes the talk right out of a person. But every night, when the pain got too bad for her to sleep, she'd sit right there at that desk, holding an old photograph. The landlady walked over to a small drawer beneath the windowsill and pulled out a small metal biscuit tin. She told me to throw this away before she went to the hospital that last time. The old woman said it was trash. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Robbie took the tin with hands that trembled uncontrollably. He opened the lid. Inside were hundreds of small, folded paper cranes made from cheap notebook paper. He unfolded one. Written inside in my shaky, pain-riddled handwriting were 4 words. I'm sorry, Robbie. Forgive me. He unfolded another. I'm sorry, Robbie. Forgive me. Every single crane, hundreds of them, contained the same 4 words. A silent, agonizing chant repeated every night while cancer ate her away from the inside. At the very bottom of the tin lay a small, creased photograph. It was the photo from 6 years ago, the one taken in the hospital room after Robbie had saved my life from his abusive uncle. His arm was in a cast, his face was bruised, but he was grinning from ear to ear, holding me close. On the back, written in his own bold handwriting from 6 years ago, I'll protect Selena forever. Robbie collapsed onto the small iron bed. He pressed the photo and the folded paper cranes to his face and wept. It was a sound I had never heard from him before, a raw, guttural howl of absolute ruin, echoing off the bare walls of the tiny room where I had died. Alone, I drifted down beside him, reaching out my ghostly hand, trying to touch his hair. But my fingers passed right through him, leaving only a cold breeze. Robbie, I whispered, tears spilling from my spectral eyes. Don't cry. It doesn't hurt anymore. But he couldn't hear me. By the following week, the story had become a national sensation. The media had pieced together the timeline, Jim Hartley's public interview, the medical archives from Lydian, the blacklisting of a prodigy surgeon, and her tragic, solitary death from gastric cancer, while her ex-fiancé rose to fame, treating the very same illness. Fairview General was swarmed by reporters. The hospital's PR department was in damage control mode, but the public outrage was unyielding. Robbie didn't go home. He slept in his office at the hospital, surrounded by medical charts, refusing to answer calls from his lawyer, his board, or Whitney. On Thursday morning, the head of surgery, Dr. Marcus, walked into Robbie's office, slamming a file on his desk. Robbie, you need to pull yourself together, Dr. Marcus said sternly. The board is considering suspending you until this PR storm passes. But we have a critical case today. The mayor's daughter has an advanced gastrointestinal tumor. It's an identical pathology to the one you operated on last month. You're the only one who can do it. Robbie sat behind his desk, staring blankly at his hands. His hands, the hands that had performed over 500 surgeries, the hands that had been praised as the most precise in the state, were shaking. I can't do it, Robbie said, his voice completely hollow. What do you mean you can't do it? Dr. Marcus snapped. You're the chief of surgical oncology. The patient is already scrubbed and in or 3. My hands won't stop, Robbie whispered, holding them up. They trembled violently, like dry leaves in a winter storm. I can't hold the scalpel. Dr. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. Robbie, this is your career on the line. If you walk away from this surgery, the board will strip your license for medical negligence under pressure. Robbie didn't answer. He stood up slowly, pulled off his white coat and folded it neatly over the back of his chair. Let them strip it, he said softly. I never deserved it anyway. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Dr. Marcus shouting behind him. As he walked down the surgical corridor toward the elevator, he passed or 3. Through the glass window, he saw the operating table, the blue sterile drapes, the overhead lamps glowing brightly. 6 years ago, I had stood in a room just like that, preparing to save his grandmother. And today, standing in the same hallway, Robbie finally understood what true helplessness felt like. The cemetery on the west side of town was quiet under the gray afternoon sky. Jim Hartley sat on a stone bench near my grave, holding a small brass urn containing my ashes. His hair had turned completely white over the past few days, his body looking frail and stooped inside his black coat. Footsteps sounded on the wet gravel path. Jim didn't look up as Robbie approached. Robiegor no kout, no suit. Just a plain black sweater, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by days of sleeplessness. He stopped 5 feet away from Jim, staring at the small brass urn in the old man's hands. I resigned today, Robbie said quietly. His voice was flat, carrying no anger, no sarcasm, only a vast, empty silence. Jim slowly raised his head. Why? You worked so hard for that position. It was never my position, Robbie said, looking down at the headstone bearing my name, Selina Hartley, 1995 to 2021. She was the one who was supposed to be the specialist. I only learned oncology because I wanted to prove I was better than her. I wanted her to see me on television and feel regret. Robbie let out a bitter, silent laugh. And all the while, she was dying of the very thing I was studying. I spent 6 years learning how to save people with gastric cancer, and I let the only person who mattered bleed to death because of my pride. Jim looked at the young man standing before him, the boy he had once dismissed as a penniless nobody. She didn't hate you, Robbie, Jim said softly, his voice cracking. Even at the very end, when she was coughing up blood in that tiny room, she told me she was glad you made it. She said she was proud that you became the doctor she always knew you could be. Robbie's knees gave out. He fell to the damp earth in front of my grave, his hands clutching the wet grass. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the monument. I'm sorry, Selina, he sobbed, his body shaking with violent, uncontrollable weeping. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please come back. Please. My ghost drifted down, kneeling beside him in the grass. I reached out, resting my hand gently over his trembling shoulder. For the first time in 6 years, a faint sensation of warmth passed between us. Not physical, but something deeper, something tied to the lingering threads of a love that had survived betrayal, misunderstanding, and death. I forgive you, Robbie, I whispered, smiling through my tears. I freed you a long time ago. Now you have to free yourself. As if sensing something, Robbie looked up sharply, staring at the empty air. Beside him, a soft wind blew through the cemetery, scattering the dry autumn leaves across the lawn. Slowly, my soul began to feel light, weightless. The cold ache that had tied me to the earth for 3 years was dissolving, floating away into the gray sky. I looked at Robbie one last time as he wept over the headstone, clutching the silver medal against his chest. 5 years later, in a small, remote mountain town 300 miles from the capital, a tiny, free clinic sat at the end of a quiet street. The sign above the door read, Hartley Memorial Community Clinic. Inside, an older doctor with white hair was busy organizing medications behind the counter, while a younger man in a simple blue surgical scrub sat at a wooden desk, carefully examining an old farmer's stomach scans. The younger man was thin, his hair lightly silvered at the temples, but his hands, when he held the light board, were completely steady. It's a benign ulcer, Mr. Zhang, Robbie said smoothly, his voice gentle and patient as he explained the chart to the farmer. No need to worry. I'll prescribe some medication, and you'll be back in the fields by next week. The farmer smiled gratefully, placing a basket of fresh apples on the desk. Thank you, Dr. McAvoy. You and old Dr. Hartley are lifesavers. Our village doesn't know what we'd do without this clinic. It's free of charge, Robbie replied with a soft smile. Just take care of your health. After the patient left, Jim walked over, setting a cup of hot tea on Robbie's desk. You performed 3 minor procedures today, Jim said, looking at his former rival with quiet respect. Your hands haven't shaken once in 5 years. Robbie picked up the tea, staring out the window at the green mountains framing the quiet town. They only shook when I was fighting for things that didn't matter, Robbie said softly. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was the old photo from the hospital, the one taken 6 years ago, showing him and Selina smiling together. Beside it lay the silver competition medal and a single paper crane, its folded edges slightly faded by time. Every month, the clinic provided free cancer screenings and gastrointestinal care to impoverished villagers who couldn't afford city hospitals. Every patient who walked through the door received treatment regardless of their ability to pay. Robbie didn't work for fame. He didn't work for promotions. He worked in the quiet shadows, living out the promise he had once made to a young woman in a hospital hallway many years ago. As the afternoon sun cast long, warm shadows across the wooden desk, a gentle breeze rustled the curtains by the open window. Robbie looked up toward the light, a peaceful, quiet smile touching his lips. Good afternoon, Selina, he whispered to the wind.